I'd like you to take your Bibles and go ahead and turn over with me to Psalm chapter 15. We've been going through the Psalms little by little here over the years, and we're up to Psalm chapter 15. We're going to take a look at this psalm today and explore walking in God's righteousness. And so that's going to be the title of my message, is The Walk of the Righteous. The Walk of the Righteous. Psalm 15 is likely a reflection of David after successfully bringing the Ark of the Covenant back to Mount Zion. And his first attempt failed because he neglected the instructions that God gave them on transporting the ark, if you remember that story. It was supposed to be carried on poles, right? But they decided they were going to carry it on a wagon. They put it on a wagon, and of course Uzzah touched it and he died, and he was left confused about, David was left confused about what was happening. But here we have this next event where he's bringing the ark up. So let's read Psalm 15 from verses, down 1 through 5 here. Lord, who may abide in your tabernacle, who may dwell in your holy hill? He who walks uprightly and works righteousness and speaks the truth in his heart. He who does not backbite with his tongue, nor does evil to his neighbor, nor does he take up a reproach against his friend, in whose eyes a vile person is despised, but he honors those who fear the Lord. He who swears to his own hurt and does not change. He who does not put out his money at usury, nor does he take a bribe against the innocent. He who does these things shall never be moved, or as some translations say, shaken. It's a great psalm. Asks the question and gives the answer. A lot of depth here. Now, again, this is regarding his second victorious trek up Mount Zion, and it wasn't just a physical journey. Even though it was physical, it wasn't just a physical journey. It was really a spiritual lesson for righteous living. You see, walking up Mount Zion symbolized more than just a royal procession. It represented a pursuit of life that is aligned with God's way. So today we're going to unpack the concept of the walk of the righteous through three key thoughts here in Psalm 15. Number one, and all of them are going to begin with the same phrase, the walk of the righteous, the title, and then I'll give you something at the end. So number one is the walk of the righteous seeks God's presence. That's number one. The walk of the righteous seeks God's presence. We see this in verse 1. David begins the psalm by asking, Lord, who may abide in your sanctuary, who may live on your holy hill? So this is a question that assumes a deep desire to be in God's presence. Why would you ask the question otherwise? For David, being on Mount Zion wasn't about his own kingship. It was really about acknowledging God's throne. See, when David brought the ark to Mount Zion, he placed it in a tent for all people to see, and he put instruments and singers and musicians to continually offer praise at the tabernacle. And this really symbolized a lifestyle of worship, a whole lifestyle of worship, reflecting a desire, not for simple temporary visits, but for abiding in God's presence continually. And this means that to abide in God's sanctuary means more than attending worship services, but it implies lingering, staying, and immersing yourself in the atmosphere of God's glory. If you've ever visited famous places, and I'm sure there's some places you can talk about, I visited this particular famous place. It's nice to see them and to say that you've been there, but it's not dwelling. It's not staying there. And it's a different experience altogether when you've stayed around for a while and you've taken things in. And to live on his holy hill points to a permanent state of communion with God. See, for us today, righteous living begins with prioritizing God's presence in our lives. It isn't simply limited to worshiping God on the Sabbath. It's more than that. I mean, we have an appointment to be here on the seventh day. God tells us that very clearly. He has an appointment with us, and we're called to be in worship with him. But righteous living goes beyond that alone. It's a daily walk, a constant awareness of being near God, of being with him. Worship really needs to be a lifestyle, not an event, but a lifestyle. And this earthly practice prepares us for an eternity of enjoying God's presence. So you see, when we seek God's presence regularly, it truly transforms the way we think. And that's what he wants from us. He wants transformation in our lives. He wants us to think differently than our physical human selves. It changes our perspective from our own to the way God sees things. And one way it does that is in life's challenges. And we all have challenges. It makes those challenges a little bit less daunting. Why? Because you know God is with you. You know God is walking with you, and He's ever near you. And this daily pursuit of Him helps us be anchored in faith and joy and hope, even in the most difficult seasons. Point number two. Point number two is the walk of the righteous obeys God's precepts. We see this in verses 2 to 5. I'm going to break this down because there's actually 3 different ways he talks about this. But David outlines these 3 fundamental precepts for righteous living. We're going to call it integrity, honesty, and sincerity. Now, in integrity, we see it in the beginning of verse 2, in verse 4 as well. So we see David emphasizes the importance of being blameless in character. Now, blamelessness does not mean sinlessness. That's not what it means. None of us are sinless. There is not a single individual born on this earth except for Jesus that was sinless. But what it does do is it points to a soundness of character and loyalty to God. I want you to think about Noah, for instance. And it says about Noah in Genesis 6 that he was described as a righteous man. And he walked before God blameless among all the people at that time. In the same way, Abraham was called to, remember, God said to him, walk before me and be blameless. And then God gave him the promises. So both of these men demonstrated devotion to God even in challenging circumstances. Now, as many of you know, there are plenty of challenging circumstances in life. And you can probably recount many challenging circumstances in your own lives. But challenges are not always calamities. In fact, those are maybe some of the more easy challenges, if we're going to call that, to overcome. There are often challenges that are way worse. And those are the challenges that make you feel better than you really are. The challenges that tend to stroke your ego. The challenges that tend to make you think I'm really somebody when maybe you're not somebody. These types of challenges make us, they really are the challenges that Satan didn't overcome, of feeling really good about himself. So we have to resist being swayed by flattery or enticed by sin and avoid the compromise that muddles spiritual clarity. Let me just reference Proverbs chapter 25 and verse 26. Proverbs 25 and verse 26. He gives us a warning, Solomon does, where he says, like a muddied spring or a polluted well is a righteous man who gives way to the wicked. So integrity like Noah, integrity like Abraham, requires loyalty to God even when the world pressures us to compromise. Now, the next thing he talks about is honesty. You see that in the latter half of verse 2 and verse 5. This is another way that we obey God's precepts. Walking in righteousness requires honesty, not just in words, brethren, but it requires honesty in actions as well. And one of the ways that David highlights this is with financial integrity. This is how he talks about it. Now, in ancient Israel, practices like charging exorbitant interest or accepting bribes was very common among the people. And God's law warns against this as well as judges against taking bribes. Honesty is really a foundational principle for walking righteously, whether it's in business or it's in personal relationships or civic responsibilities. Honesty honors God and builds trust in our communities. And then again, he talks about another way of sincerity. Sincerity. Speaking truthfully. You can see this in the latter half of verse 2, as well as verses 3 and 4. Righteous living also demands sincerity in our words. And David highlights the importance of truthful speech in the ways of avoiding slander, refraining from harming others with our words. And we talked about this for a long time in the Word series. Words have a way of building up people, and words have a way of tearing down people. They can bless or they can curse. And sincere conversation reflects a heart aligned with God's principles, and it demonstrates respect for others and a commitment to peace. So these are the ways that David highlights to obey God's precepts. And then point number 3 is the walk of the righteous trusts in God's promises. And we can see this in verse 5. So we see the psalm conclude with this powerful assurance. Whoever does these things will not be shaken. He will not be shaken. Now, this promise reflects the stability and security that comes from living righteously. Trusting in God's promises doesn't mean life will be free of trials. That's not what that means. But it does mean that we are anchored in His unchanging faithfulness. I want to reference Hebrews 12, verse 27. I want you to consider these words in Hebrews 12, 27. Now this, Paul writes, yet once more indicates the removal of those things that are being shaken, as of things that are made, that the things which cannot be shaken may remain. So this reminds us that God is shaking everything that can be shaken, leaving only what is unshakable. What is unshakable, brethren? What is unshakable? God's promises and His kingdom. They are completely unshakable. And God is shaking things out because He wants to know who's going to hold on to that tree. And so when we put our trust in God, we really align ourselves with that unshakable kingdom. So David experienced this himself. David faced betrayal, he faced exile, personal failure, but he constantly returned to God's promises over and over again. You know, I remember when I was younger, I'd always visit my grandparents for the summer, for a week at each grandparent. And one thing that struck out to me when I got older was I always felt secure, more secure probably than any other place at my grandparents' house than any place that I ever was. And the reason, I figured this out later, the reason is because things stayed the same. They were always the same. And to me, that was security. That was stability. That was a support that I could always count on. It made me feel secure. And that's what that means, that when we trust in God, when we do the same way, we can trust in His promises. It gives us that security. And when we feel that security, then we can live in a way that's righteous before God. It gives us that confidence. You see, we don't create the path of righteousness living ourselves. We don't create that path. We don't forge some new path. That's not our job. That's not what we do. We don't know where we're going. So Jesus set that path, and we follow that path. That's what we're to do. So God created it. Now we just trust Him, and we follow that path, and we have the confidence to do that. So as we reflect back on Psalm 15, we see that the walk of the righteous is really more than outward actions, but it's really about a heart that's completely and utterly devoted to God. So we talked about, number one, seek God's presence. Make worship and communion with God a daily priority. 2 was to obey God's precepts. Live with integrity, honesty, and sincerity, reflecting God's character in everything that we do. And 3, to trust in God's promises. Stand firm in the assurance of God's faithfulness, knowing that those who walk righteously will never be shaken. So as you go through this week, this upcoming week, I'd like you to ask yourself, how is it that I can seek God's presence more deeply? What can I do to seek God's presence more deeply? And what areas of my life do I need to change, to alter, to follow His precepts? And how can I anchor my faith more firmly in His promises? So let's walk the path of the righteous together, trusting in God in every step of the way.